Be me, Nova. Work as a marketing coordinator. Always been the type to call out workplace microaggressions and casual sexism, constantly educating co-workers about gender dynamics and systemic oppression. Have this really annoying habit of turning every conversation into a teachable moment about patriarchy. Like when Jake from accounting complained about his divorce settlement, I had to explain how women actually get screwed over financially in most divorces due to wage gaps and career interruptions. Or when my boss mentioned hiring preferences, I'd launch into detailed explanations about unconscious bias and glass ceilings. People started avoiding the break room when I was there. But whatever, someone has to speak truth to power. Anyway, a few years back I went through this whole gender exploration phase. Started identifying as male, began transitioning, whole 9 yards. Figured I'd experience firsthand what male privilege actually looked like. Boy was I wrong. Lived as Archie for about 3 years. Holy shit, what an eye-opener. First reality check came pretty quick. Remember being at this coffee shop, saw this cute barista, Sarah. Back when I presented as female, starting conversations was so easy. Guys would approach me, offer to buy drinks, hold doors, general friendliness. Figured as a man, I'd have even more social power. Walked up to Sarah during her break. Hey, I'm Archie. I come here pretty often and always see you working hard. Her whole body language immediately shifted. Took a step back, arms crossed, gave me this look like I was some kind of predator. I'm working. Please leave me alone. Cold, harsh, immediate dismissal. Tried being friendlier. Oh, no worries. Just thought you seemed cool. Maybe we could grab coffee sometime. She literally called over her manager. Manager, this big dude named Rick, comes over all aggressive. Is there a problem here? Sarah, this guy won't leave me alone. Rick gives me the death stare. Time to go, buddy. I'm standing there confused as hell. When I was presenting female, I could chat with anyone. Workers were always polite and accommodating. This was my first taste of how men get treated when they show any interest. Thought it was just a fluke. Oh, how naive I was. Next week, decided to try being social at this local bookstore. Saw this woman browsing the feminist theory section. Perfect, right? Approached respectfully. Excuse me, I notice you're looking at some great books. I've read a few of those. Instant hostility. I don't need a man mansplaining feminism to me. Before I could explain, I was actually well versed in feminist theory. She just walked away. Store employee comes over. Sir, we've had complaints about customers being harassed. Harassment? I made one polite comment about books. When I presented as female, I had endless conversations with strangers about books, politics, whatever. People were eager to engage, share recommendations, be helpful. As Archie, instant suspicion and hostility. Started noticing this pattern everywhere. Tried joining a hiking group. When I'd show up as female Nova, everyone was welcoming. Oh, you should sit with us. Let me help you with your gear. Want to share trail mix? As Archie, barely acknowledged. Women in the group actively avoided me, would cluster together and speak in hushed tones when I approached. One time overheard Jennifer saying, I don't feel comfortable with strange men on these hikes. Strange men? I'd been coming to this group for 2 years as Nova. They knew me, but now I was just another threatening male presence. The social isolation was brutal. Decided to try volunteer work, figured that would be better. Showed up to help at the animal shelter. Coordinator Lisa barely made eye contact. Gave me all the worst jobs. Cleaning kennels, moving heavy stuff, working alone. When I was Nova, I got to work with the cute puppies, interact with potential adopters, handle the social media. As Archie, I was literally treated like disposable manual labor. One day tried to pet this adorable golden retriever. Little girl there with her mom immediately got scared. Mom yanked the kid away. Don't talk to strangers, honey. Gave me this look like I was a pedophile for existing near her child. When I was Nova, kids would run up to me all the time, parents would smile and make small talk. Now, I was automatically a threat. The romantic rejection was the absolute worst part though. Tried approaching women at the grocery store, library, park, wherever. Every single interaction followed the same pattern. Immediate suspicion, body language screaming, get away from me. One woman at the farmer's market actually said, I have a boyfriend, before I even opened my mouth. I was just asking about her dog's breed. Another time at the gym, complimented Emma on her form during squats. She immediately went to the front desk to complain. Got called into the manager's office about inappropriate behavior. Inappropriate? I said nice form, the same comment I'd given and received countless times as Nova. When I was female, men would approach me constantly. Sure, some were awkward or pushy, but most were just trying to make conversation. I'd always lectured them about respecting women's space and reading social cues. Turns out when you're male, there are no acceptable social cues. Everything is interpreted as threatening or predatory. Tried being extra careful, extra respectful. Would approach women in broad daylight, public spaces, keep respectful distance. Didn't matter. The rejection was swift, harsh, and often humiliating. At the library, asked Rebecca if she'd like to get coffee sometime. She loudly said, "No, I don't date creeps who approach women in public." Entire reading area turned to stare at me. Felt like a criminal for attempting normal human interaction. When I was Nova, getting asked out was flattering even when I said no. Guys would approach nervously, hopefully, and I'd politely decline. They'd usually say, "No worries, have a great day," and move on. But when I was doing the approaching as Archie, the responses were brutal. "Ew, no. Get away from me. I don't owe you anything. Stop harassing me." And these were for polite, respectful approaches. Started understanding why some men seemed bitter or frustrated, when literally every attempt at human connection gets treated as harassment, when you're automatically assumed to have predatory intentions, when women cross the street to avoid walking near you, when mothers pull their children closer when you pass, when store employees follow you around like you're going to shoplift. The psychological toll is devastating. Remember one particularly bad day. Had tried talking to 3 different women at a street fair. Each interaction more humiliating than the last. First woman, Michelle, told me to learn to read the room when I asked about her handmade jewelry. Second woman literally ran away when I asked for directions. Third woman called security when I complimented her rescue dog. Security escorted me out like I was some dangerous criminal, went home and just broke down crying. The loneliness was suffocating. As Nova, I was constantly surrounded by people wanting to talk, connect, help. As Archie, I felt like a leper. Every social interaction was a minefield. Started avoiding public spaces, stopped trying to meet people. The depression was real. Began understanding male suicide rates in a way I never had before. When society treats your very existence as threatening. When every attempt at connection is rebuffed with hostility. When you're invisible unless you're being perceived as a problem. Started going to this diner regularly, just to have some human interaction. Waitress Debbie was professional but distant, never the warm, chatty service I got as Nova. One day she was training a new girl, Amy. Overheard Debbie saying, "Watch out for the guys who come in alone, they're usually trouble." I was sitting right there, eating my eggs Benedict, reading a book, bothering nobody, but I was automatically categorized as trouble for existing while male. Tried dating through friends, figured that would be safer. My friend Kate set me up with her co-worker Jessica, showed up to the coffee meetup. Jessica took one look at me and immediately seemed uncomfortable. Kept checking her phone, giving one-word answers. Cut the date short after 20 minutes. "This isn't going to work out. You seem nice, but I'm not feeling it." Later found out from Kate that Jessica said I seemed too intense and kind of desperate. Desperate? I'd barely said anything. Just tried to make normal conversation about work, hobbies, travel. Same conversations that flowed easily when I was Nova. But as Archie, my mere presence radiated desperation somehow. Started realizing how differently women interpreted male behavior. When I was Nova talking to men, I saw nervousness as endearing, effort as flattering, persistence as romantic, but experiencing it from the other side. That same nervousness read as creepy, effort read as trying too hard. Any follow-up contact read as stalking. The double standards were staggering. Remember this one interaction at a bookstore cafe. Spent an hour reading, noticed this woman Sarah at the next table. She kept glancing over, seemed friendly. When I was Nova, these glances were invitations to chat, so I approached respectfully. "Excuse me, I noticed you reading Toni Morrison. Have you read her other work?" Immediate ice-cold response. "I'm trying to read. Please leave me alone." But those glances, I wasn't imagining them, realized that as Archie, I was completely misreading social cues. What felt like interest was probably just casual looking around, but women never had to learn to read these microscopic differences. They could approach anyone without being labeled threatening. Tried adjusting my approach, being even more careful. Would only talk to women who spoke to me first. Even then, conversations would die quickly. This woman, Elena, at the gym, started chatting about workout routines. Seemed friendly, we talked for 10 minutes about different exercises. I thought we had a connection, asked if she'd like to grab a protein smoothie. "Oh, I was just being polite. I'm not interested in anything like that." The humiliation was constant. Even when women initiated conversation, showing romantic interest was still inappropriate. But as Nova, when men I'd chatted with asked me out, it seemed natural, expected even, started understanding why men developed elaborate strategies and pickup techniques. Not because they were naturally manipulative, but because straightforward, honest approaches were met with hostility. When normal human behavior gets labeled as harassment, when politeness is interpreted as deception, when showing interest makes you a predator, people adapt by becoming more indirect, more calculated, which then gets labeled as manipulation, vicious cycle. The workplace dynamics were eye-opening too. As Nova, I could interrupt, speak over people, show emotion freely, was seen as passionate and engaged. As Archie, any interruption was mansplaining. Showing emotion was unstable. Speaking up was dominating the conversation. Had to completely change my communication style. Speak less, defer more, constantly apologize. Even then, still got labeled as taking up too much space. During meetings, if I agreed with a female colleague, I was patronizing. If I disagreed, I was invalidating women's voices. There was literally no winning. Remember this presentation I gave about marketing strategies? Afterward, my coworker Diana said I was mansplaining basic concepts. The exact same presentation I'd given as Nova was praised as insightful. Realized that the content didn't matter. My gender determined how everything was interpreted. Started documenting these experiences. Figured I'd write about it when I transitioned back. Show other feminists what male experience was really like. Boy, was I wrong about that too. When I eventually transitioned back to Nova, tried sharing these insights with my feminist friends. Thought they'd be fascinated by this unique perspective. Instead, got complete dismissal. That's not real discrimination, just uncomfortable social situations. Men created these problems themselves through centuries of predatory behavior. You're centering male experiences in feminist spaces. That's just what accountability looks like. Tried explaining the psychological impact, the constant rejection, isolation, assumption of bad intentions. Women have dealt with worse for millennia. At least you weren't afraid of being raped or murdered. Male loneliness is not women's responsibility to fix. Technically true, but missing the point entirely. Wasn't asking women to fix anything. Just wanted acknowledgement that men face unique struggles too. That the narrative of universal male privilege was incomplete. But bringing up male suffering was automatically labeled as misogyny. My friend Janet actually accused me of internalizing patriarchal propaganda. Janet, who I'd known for 5 years, who'd seen me advocate for women's rights countless times. Apparently experiencing male rejection firsthand made me a gender traitor. Tried sharing with my coworker Lisa, explained how differently I was treated in identical situations. Well, yeah, women have to be cautious because of male violence. When I pointed out that I was the same person, same intentions, just different presentation. It's not about you personally, it's about patterns of behavior. But those patterns meant every individual man got prejudged, treated as guilty until proven innocent, and proof of innocence was nearly impossible to establish, because any attempt to demonstrate good intentions was itself seen as manipulation. Tried explaining this catch-22 to my friend Morgan. If men don't like being seen as threats, they should call out other men's bad behavior. Women can't tell the difference between good and bad men, so we have to be careful with all of them. Asked how men were supposed to meet people or form connections under these conditions. That's not women's problem to solve. Circular logic everywhere. Men are responsible for fixing male behavior, but individual men can't prove they're different. And expressing frustration about this dynamic is itself proof of problematic attitudes. No winning scenario. Started questioning everything I'd believed about gender dynamics. Not the existence of sexism against women, that was obviously real, but the idea that patriarchy only benefited men. That male privilege was universal and unqualified. That men's complaints about dating or social interaction were just entitlement. Turns out there were costs to male gender roles I'd never considered. When you're automatically seen as a threat. When your sexuality is inherently viewed as dangerous. When expressing emotional needs makes you weak or manipulative. When economic pressure falls entirely on your shoulders. When asking for help is seen as failure. These weren't privileges. They were burdens that came with whatever advantages male status provided. But suggesting this in feminist spaces was like speaking heresy. Remember trying to bring this up at a work diversity meeting. We were discussing ways to make the workplace more inclusive. I suggested that men might also benefit from emotional support and connection. Dead silence. Then Patricia from HR said, "This meeting is about addressing discrimination, not men's feelings." Feelings? I was talking about social isolation and psychological health. but male emotional needs were automatically dismissed as frivolous, even though male suicide rates suggested otherwise. Tried a different approach, focused on specific policy suggestions. Maybe networking events could include structured activities to help with organic conversation. Maybe we could train people on how to give constructive feedback instead of harsh rejection. Maybe we could acknowledge that social skills aren't equally distributed. We're not going to teach men how to be better at bothering women. Bothering women? I was talking about basic human connection. Realized that any male struggle was automatically reframed as an attack on women. Male loneliness became entitlement to women's attention. Male social difficulty became failure to respect boundaries. Male emotional needs became emotional labor demands. There was no acceptable way to discuss male suffering without being labeled misogynistic. Even my own lived experience was invalidated. You only experienced that for 3 years. Try being a woman your whole life. As if suffering was a competition. As if acknowledging male struggles somehow diminished female ones. Started realizing how much my previous activism had been performative. I'd lectured men about their privilege without understanding their actual experiences. Assumed that gender dynamics was zero-sum. That anything benefiting men must hurt women. But my time as Archie showed me that wasn't true. Men and women both faced unique challenges. Both deserved empathy and support. But suggesting this made me a both sides feminist. Apparently believing in genuine equality instead of female supremacy was controversial. Tried having this conversation with my friend Rachel. Explained how my perspective had evolved. You sound like one of those men's rights activists now. Men's rights activists? For suggesting that men's emotional needs matter? You're falling into anti-feminist talking points. Anti-feminist? For sharing my own lived experience? Realized that my feminist friend group had become an echo chamber. Any dissent from orthodox positions was immediately dismissed. Nuance was seen as betrayal. Complexity was labeled as internalized oppression. Started feeling isolated in a different way. As Archie, I was isolated because society treated me as a threat. As Nova again, I was isolated because my feminist community treated my experiences as heresy. Couldn't share what I'd learned without being accused of gender treason. Couldn't advocate for a more nuanced understanding of gender dynamics. Couldn't suggest that maybe, just maybe, both men and women deserved compassion. The irony was crushing. I'd spent years lecturing people about empathy and understanding, but when I tried to extend that empathy to male experiences, suddenly empathy was problematic. Suddenly understanding was dangerous. Suddenly my own community turned against me. Realized that a lot of feminist discourse wasn't actually about equality. It was about maintaining a narrative where women were pure victims and men were pure oppressors. Any evidence contradicting that narrative was suppressed. Any complexity was flattened into simple, good versus evil stories. Any suggestion that men might also suffer was treated as misogynist propaganda. But I'd lived it, felt the crushing weight of constant rejection, experienced the isolation of being automatically classified as dangerous, witnessed the double standards and circular logic firsthand. My feminist friends could dismiss academic studies about male suicide or social isolation. They could claim those statistics were misleading or irrelevant. But they couldn't dismiss my personal testimony. Except they did. Turns out, lived experience only mattered when it supported the approved narrative. When it challenged that narrative, it became internalized oppression, or false consciousness, or patriarchal manipulation. My own perceptions were invalidated by people who claimed to believe women, unless those women said something inconvenient. Started understanding why some people became disillusioned with feminist spaces. It wasn't necessarily because they hated women or opposed equality, it was because they'd experienced the movement's blindness to male suffering, its refusal to acknowledge complexity, its tendency to silence dissent through character assassination. My friend Alex, who'd left our activist group years earlier, suddenly made sense. At the time, I'd assumed he was just fragile and couldn't handle having his privilege challenged. Now I realized he'd probably tried to share his own experiences, tried to add nuance to our discussions, and been labelled a misogynist for his trouble. The movement I'd dedicated years to had a massive blind spot, could analyse power dynamics in incredible detail, could identify subtle forms of bias and discrimination, but completely ignored the ways traditional gender roles hurt men too, completely dismissed male emotional needs as illegitimate. Completely refused to acknowledge that constant rejection and social isolation were real problems. Not because these things didn't matter, but because acknowledging them might complicate the narrative, might suggest that gender dynamics were more complex than oppressor versus oppressed, might require actually caring about men's well-being, and that was apparently unthinkable. Here I am now, still believing in equality, still supporting women's rights, but with a much more complicated understanding of gender dynamics. Knowing that men face brutal rejection and social isolation that most women never experience. Knowing that expressing this knowledge makes me a traitor to my own movement. Knowing that the people I once considered allies will dismiss my lived experience, because it doesn't fit their ideology. The most frustrating part is that none of this had to be zero-sum. We could acknowledge male suffering without minimizing female suffering. We could work to help isolated men without reducing support for women. We could create more nuanced understanding of gender roles that recognized everyone's humanity. But that would require admitting that feminist analysis was incomplete. That male privilege came with costs. That women also participated in harmful gender dynamics. That solutions needed to consider everyone's experiences. Apparently that level of intellectual honesty was too much to ask. So here I am, caught between worlds. Too feminist for men's rights spaces. Too sympathetic to male experiences for feminist spaces. Knowing things I can't unsee. Having experienced realities I can't unknow. Understanding that gender dynamics are messier and more complicated than anyone wants to admit. And that sometimes the people who claim to care about truth and justice care more about maintaining their worldview than confronting inconvenient facts. Anyway, that's my story. Probably makes me sound like a terrible person to both sides. But living as Archie for 3 years taught me things that years of feminist theory couldn't. Showed me that empathy and understanding shouldn't be conditional. That complexity and nuance are more valuable than simple narratives. That maybe, just maybe, we could build a better world if we actually listened to everyone's experiences, instead of dismissing the ones that don't fit our preconceptions. Revolutionary concept, I know.